So today I would like to talk about the old gods. I'd like to talk about the old witch gods. Now, what's important to understand about the witch gods is that witches have many traditions associated with them. There's not one central witchcraft tradition. There's not one central, witch organization. So witches have existed throughout all time and all cultures. And so usually what a witch represents is someone who is initiated into the mysteries, is capable of working magic and creating results and making change happen. Oftentimes witches are called upon or were called upon for things like medicine and healing and counseling and even settling disputes and things like that. So in the big scheme of things, the witches were always part of the wisdom of a community. A witch was, or whatever they would call them. Everybody, they didn't necessarily call them witches, were part of the healing of the community. It wasn't until the propaganda that occurred, especially during the Inquisition in Spain, but many parts of the Inquisition, where we got things like, you don't want to deal with them because they eat babies and things like that. Have you noticed that no matter what the culture is, if you're trying to go against a certain sect of people, they tend to, one, eat babies. They tend to be sexual deviants or somehow trying to maybe get molest children or something like that. There's always these kinds of they're murderers. They tend to hex people. They're responsible if you get a wart. They're responsible if your crops if your crops fail. They were the great scapegoat. But remember, during that period of time, the church had all access to printed material. They were all powerful. There was no separation of church and state. They were the state. And the Church of Rome especially pretty much owned Europe, even though there were separate monarchs. Those monarchs were beholden to that Church of Rome. And you can just go look in your history books and see how bad it was. And so when the church decided that certain people were bad, then those certain people were bad, and they got set in stone. Basically, it was in the zeitgeist of the common people at that time, and then they taught their children, and they taught their children, and they taught their children, and then over time, this whole idea of these healers, these counselors, these helpers, these magical folk turned into they are evil, they are scary, they are bad, they must be destroyed, which caused the already somewhat secretive practices of different craft traditions, because secrecy is powerful, to go even more underground. And the more underground it is, the more mysterious it is, the more scary it is for people that don't understand it, and it just keeps on going. So to try to resurrect the ancient gods, a lot of times people will look to these old, or even the ancient witchcraft practices, they'll look to, a lot of times, these old documents, which were propaganda. And so then you get these bizarre modern cults trying to recreate a witchcraft that never really existed. Sort of like this sort of a nefarious sort of craft that never really existed, and they say, "Oh yeah, well this is traditional witchcraft, not Wicca, and it's more sinister." And it's like, no, that's not true necessarily. I mean, there's always been sinister people in any culture, but there was no big organized sinister witch cult. That just never happened. There's no proof of that. There's no proof that ever happened. So whether you're a religious person that's trying to excoriate, just get rid of all occultism because of those old beliefs, or whether you're trying to recreate an ancient cult that never existed, Either way, it's two sides of the same error. And the reason why I bring all of this up is that a lot of the old gods have gotten maligned in the process. Because, well, if witches called on those gods, they must be evil, that kind of thing. Or those ancient pagan gods are responsible for so many ills, et cetera, et cetera. Well, now what you have on top of that is you have the popularization of what people call witchcraft, and it's been tried to be given as pure fact that witches were part of some organized ancient fertility cult. And so then you have this whole god and the goddess and the Holly King and the Oak King and all of those kinds of stories and myths, as if it were some sort of very clean-cut tradition that all witches followed. And none of that's true. I mean, all of it's fine. All of it has truth in it. But you can't look back in history and say, oh, witches did this, or they followed this god, or they did this thing, or they did that thing, because it's just not there. It's just there's nothing to support any of that. If you want to read I think it's a very good book. A lot of people don't care for it. I think it's a good book. It's called Triumph of the Moon by Hutton. What is it? Ronald Hutton? I can't remember. I think it's Ronald Hutton, but it's called Triumph of the Moon. You can get, and he's a scholar. I mean, he's a historian. You can see how both on one side of the coin, there was a lot of propaganda against people who are now who were then called witches. That maybe they didn't call themselves that, but they ended up being called witches. Where the propaganda of the craft started on one hand, and on the other hand, this false history, this false mythology about what the craft is, cropped up in the 50s, and then later on, especially really got crazy in the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s. So that in the craft, there's no real understanding about what the witch gods are and what the old gods are, because it's just so crazy. It's just so mixed up. So Dion Fortune said all gods are one. There's one God. All goddesses are one goddess. There's one goddess. And that's what the wise have always taught. That's what the wise have always believed, that there may be cultural differences. There may be pantheons that express different aspects of the one, but it's all one. And it's so it's similar to how a light is separated into a rainbow. That there are many gods. There aren't many gods. There's one, but there are many archetypes. There are many qualities of that God. So on one side of the coin, we can look at those different qualities of the one God as being a pantheon. So many people in the craft will follow a specific pantheon. Maybe they'll follow the Greek, or they might follow the Norse, or they may follow the Italian, or they may follow, different pantheons of gods and goddesses. But the wise among them realize that these are just aspects of the one, whereas the superstitious among them thinks that there are many powers. So many witches, however, don't think of those old gods as specific personalities, but as powers that are emanations of the one force. So that it's separated completely from superstition that way. So what we talk about when we talk about the qualities of spirit, we talk about things like infinite love, infinite peace, infinite joy, infinite light, infinite soul, infinite spirit, all of those things. Those all can be correspondent to different spheres on the tree of life. And those different spheres on the tree of life can correspond to not only different planets, but they can correspond to different ancient deities. And those different ancient deities, when approached through that kind of a perspective, have great power to a witch, because you're able to access those different powers and forces on that tree of life through those ancient deities. And so you can see things like, when you work with Bridget, she might be sphere 7 for you. When you're dealing with maybe Diana, she might be sphere 9. Or Hecate, she might be sphere 3. If you're dealing, with Apollo, he might be sphere 6, et cetera, et cetera. So in that regard, you recognize that everything's an emanation of the one power. We're not talking about separate powers. We're not really talking about polytheism. We're talking about not even pantheism, but maybe more like omnitheism, if you have to have a word for it. That there is but one, and that there's many ways that one can express, infinite ways that one can express itself. But one way that we can codify that and keep it clear in our head is by using our system of Hermetic Kabbalah, which is a 10-sphere on the Tree of Life system. And that's not the only way to approach the ancient gods, but it's one way to approach the ancient gods, which enables you to access the powers without the superstition. Because what happens, I've noticed, is sometimes people will say, oh, well, I need to research, all of the ancient practices of this ancient deity so that I can honor them most appropriately. And I think that that's very nice. I think it's lovely to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, I think it's wonderful. But if you take that to an extreme, what you get is this idea that there's this separate deity out there expecting certain things of you. And if you don't do those certain things, then you either won't get what you ask for, or you might even get punished. That's called superstition. That's not how gods work. That's not how gods work. Those gods will work that way for you if you choose to see them that way, but it's not the gods doing that, it's you doing that. It's your deep mind doing that. So you can create punishments for yourself based on the fact that you didn't do everything just right. Or you can create rewards for yourself based on the fact that you did everything just right. But that's not coming from the deity. Those deities, remember, are emanations of powers, and those powers are emanations of a singular power. There's a book, I'll talk about it a little bit more on a different podcast. Marianne Weinstein was a very, I think, a very important practitioner in the 80s. She's since left us, and she wrote a book called Words of Power that describes this quite well, I think. And full disclosure, she had contacted me and asked me, sent me one of the those review copies of the book, and asked if I wouldn't please review it and put it on my podcast back in my, before I took my break. And I said, of course I will, of course, and I never got around to it, and she died. So I feel really bad that I never did that. So I will eventually do that posthumously. But what she's talking about in there is that you can create magic based on old deities, but only from the perspective of the fact that they are emanations of a singular force, a singular power. Because if you start thinking that there's more than one power in the world, then nothing makes sense to you magically. If there is no omnipotence anywhere, then it's just like a matter of hoping that your deity is stronger than another deity that might be going against you, or whatever. That there are opposing forces, and that you hope that you pick the right deity this time because they've got to be stronger than those other forces. No, that's not how it is at all. There is a singular force. We learned this luckily in Psalm magic, so many of us really understand this clearly. There's a singular force. There's one power. One. There's only one. There can't be anything else. There's nothing to oppose it, nothing to thwart it, nothing to do anything other than be part of it. Everything is created out of one power. Now, like we said, just like just like a ray of light can be separated into a rainbow, so can we separate our understanding of this one power into those different qualities. And we can personify those different qualities in order to make it more understandable to our deep minds. And that's a very powerful thing to do. But again, it's also very easy to slip out of powerful thing to do and into superstitious thing to do if we are not very careful. So when you are working with any sphere on that tree of life, you can investigate and research all the deities that go along with that sphere. And you can look at the cultures behind those deities, and you can understand how they were worshipped, and you can understand the kinds of practices. And if you want to incorporate some of those practices in order to key yourself into the Akashic records, that's a very powerful thing to do, as long as you understand that that's what you're doing, rather than thinking, I am conjuring up an ancient deity who is separated and distinct from myself and who has a lot of power, and I better get this right because it could backfire on me. Because then what are you going to get? Exactly what you conjured. You're going to get exactly that experience, right? So if you are dealing with deities and the ancient gods from a point of view of being afraid, then you're going to get results based on being afraid. Now, the fear of God, like a biblical term, the fear of God like we use in the Psalms, has nothing to do with being afraid of God. It means being respectful of God, right? But if you worried that these ancient deities are somehow going to retaliate on you if you don't get things done right, it's not a very powerful way to enter into a magical operation. You want to recognize that that every power that you align yourself with is just an emanation of the one power whose will it is for you to succeed, whose will it is for you to be happy, whose will it is for you to be healthy. So that whatever you're coming to magic to solve, the will of that one power is that you succeed in that. Obviously, you're not going to get the support of that one power if you're trying to harm another person, which is where sometimes that witch's reed can be a powerful thing. But for all intents and purposes, when we are using magic, we're not necessarily, most of us aren't there to hurt people. Most of us come to magic because we have a disease that needs to be healed, or we have money that needs to be made, or we have we have a relationship that needs to be mended, or we have some unsafety that needs to be released from our lives. Something real pertinent to our well-being. And if you are contacting a deity that you have to convince that, please, wouldn't it be okay if if some of these problems weren't solved? I mean, or only if it's okay with you. How powerful is that? No, we recognize there's one power, one source, one force, one substance. It has only my best, it only wants the best for me, and I want the will of that one power. I want the will of that one power to be alive in my life. Now, I'm looking at it in this operation as being personified on the tree of life as sphere number 7, and I'm seeing that as Aphrodite. And Aphrodite is the way that one true power is presenting itself to me, and that's how it's revealing itself to me. And so I can work within Aphrodite, work within that sphere of Aphrodite to get my needs met. But I understand that it's not Aphrodite versus Hecate versus this deity, that deity. They're not warring against one another. In my operation, this is Aphrodite as an extension of the one power. And that's how I'm choosing to relate to that one power in that one type of expression of that singular power. So it's very, very helpful to use the old gods if you can do it non-superstitiously, if you can do it magically. If you start turning it into just a whole new religion, then it's not going to work out for you so well. Because when you start turning things into a whole new religion where you are, worshiping some sort of ancient deity, it opens up a whole ball of wax that you'll never get yourself out of until you stop doing that. Because you are going down a rabbit hole of ancient paganism that is not helpful. We want neo-paganism. we want the real thing. We want to have a powerful experience with the old gods. We want to have a powerful experience with the old gods, recognizing that the old gods are expressions of the one true power of the universe that wants us to succeed, wants us happy, wants us healthy, wants good things for us, and wants good things for everybody. All right, well, this has been great. Thank you so much for tuning in today. I cannot wait to work with you again. And until next time, blessed be.